The Red Scare had the U.S. government doing all it could do to prevent anything that leaned away from American democracy and towards Soviet communism. It was a paranoid belief that anything outside of a narrow way of thinking was a danger to the country. Americans were told how to think, how to live, and what to do. They were told their lives were filled with happiness and that they lived in a perfect environment. There was no tolerance outside this. The belief was that if you lived a lifestyle outside this very narrow way of thinking, there was something very wrong with you, that you were opposed to your country and the decency of society. The Beatniks emerged in opposition to this. The biggest three names of the Beatnik movement were writers Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, and William S. Burroughs. They met while attending Columbia University in New York City, where they were studying writing in the mid-1940s. Columbia was a short walk away from Harlem, where the famed African-American jazz clubs were. The three would frequent these clubs, meeting other writers, artists from Columbia while there. They would also meet, become good friends with many of the African-American contributors to the Harlem Renaissance. This included the great jazz musicians Charlie Parker, Miles Davis, John Coltrane, Dizzy Gillespie, Thelonious Monk, likely Louis Armstrong, and others. It included James Baldwin, Langston Hughes, Zora Hurston, and other Harlem Renaissance writers and artists. The Beatniks would emulate the African Americans in dress, lifestyle, speech, and thinking. I believe at this time those Columbian students who frequented these clubs would have been more the hipster movement. When this led to an influence on their writings, this is where it transitioned to the Beat or Beatnik movement. They were opposed to authority, the greed of capitalism, materialism, and conformity. They felt American values were limiting self-expression, spirituality, emotional understanding, and even standard writing styles. They lived a wild life with drugs, alcohol, and promiscuity. The viewpoint was to see one as part of the world, not separate from it. Jack Kerouac wanted to write like jazz saxophonist Charlie Parker played. He learned to be more spontaneous and open to where his thoughts and words on paper would go. Charlie was thought to play the saxophone in this improvisational way. He would often listen to Charlie Parker while he was writing. Charlie was a heavy drinker, drug taker, and lived a bohemian lifestyle. Another person the three Beatniks became close to was Neal Cassady, who I will talk about more in the episodes about Ken Kesey. Neal had been the character base for dozens of novels, films, and songs. I can't say I know of anyone in history who has had such an influence. His letters influenced both Kerouac and Ginsberg's writing styles. Kerouac often wrote in a stream of consciousness writing style, which is unedited and a sort of spilling out of words. It is the voice inside our head, talking without structure. Yet he kept the basics of writing intact. Other important writers that Kerouac, Ginsberg, Burroughs, and Cassady befriended while at Columbia were Lucien Carr, Herbert Huncke, and John Llewellyn Holmes. The Beatniks were heavily influenced by the American writers of the Lost Generation. Those writers emerging after World War I around 1920, but also the 18th century poet William Blake and 19th century American writer Henry David Thoreau. Blake wrote of the importance of freedom and spiritual enlightenment. He stressed imagination and the ability to break free from the constraints of society. Thoreau emphasized individualism, non-materialism, and believed every person should find their way to a unique life. He challenges authority. He believed in a just and more equal world, in self-reliance and nonviolent protest. The Beatniks were similar to the Lost Generation, as they felt disengaged from the American public and questioned the purpose of life as they lived in the U.S. The lost generation rebelled against current American thought, materialism, values, and looked for ways of self-expression in their writings. They sought a bohemian way of life. The Beatniks adopted these traits. Kerouac was influenced greatly by lost generation Ernest Hemingway. He based his novel On the Road after Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises, published in 1926. Ginsberg was heavily influenced by the poems of lost generation poets Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot. The Beatniks felt Native Americans and African Americans were treated unfairly by the American government. They were drawn to a number of aspects of the Native American culture. It influenced their writing as well. The Beatniks learned a great deal from Eastern religions. This included being present, eliminating self-attachment from such things as materialism, compassion for all living things, and mindfulness, or awareness of thoughts, action, and feelings. These concepts were incorporated into the core Beatnik philosophies and were used in their writings. When the Beatniks completed their studies, they would move to Greenwich Village, which was about 4 miles or 7 kilometers south of Columbia University, and still on Manhattan Island in New York City. This has been a place of bohemians since 1850, when writer Walt Whitman lived there. Then, except for Burroughs, the others would move to San Francisco. Burroughs would spend most of the next 2 decades in Latin America and then Europe. He killed his wife, claiming it was an accident. There are different stories of how this happened. One was that he was playing a William Tell archery game and he missed, trying to shoot an arrow through an apple on top of her head. The other Beatniks chose to live in San Francisco for numerous reasons. Among them, there was an emerging literary movement known as San Francisco Renaissance. San Francisco, overall, was much more bohemian and accepting of alternative lifestyles than New York City. There was also much greater access to nature. One of the inspirations of the Beatniks was in connecting with nature. The Beatniks would settle in North Beach part of San Francisco for several years. North Beach is an Italian neighborhood. Italians have generally been known to be more accepting of artists and writers. A number of Beatnik writers came from Reed College in Portland, Oregon, and University of California, Berkeley. They would join the others in North Beach. Eventually, the Beatniks would relocate to the Haight-Ashbury area after being harassed by the police in North Beach. In other cities, police would arrest Beatniks on sight. J. Edgar Hoover, director of the U.S. Bureau of Investigation, cited the Beatniks, along with communism, as being America's great enemies. This was because of their ideology. America has always been proud of its free speech. I guess that is often meant limited free speech. The Beatniks had a tremendous influence on American and British rock and roll. The Beatles and Bob Dylan were close to and strongly influenced by the Beatniks. The band The Doors claimed that they wouldn't have existed had it not been for the Beatniks. The Rolling Stones, Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, Jefferson Airplane, U2, The Animals, Grateful Dead, and many others were strongly influenced by the Beatniks. Allen Ginsberg mentored Bob Dylan and would work with Paul McCartney of the Beatles in writing songs. Ginsberg is even on the cover of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album. Protest in the U.S. to the American presence in the Vietnam War would grow stronger and stronger. This would in part cause a greater rebellion. First, Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters. Then, the hippies emerged. And I believe the stronger rebellion in part took away momentum from the Beatniks. The Beatniks then lasted for several more years, once the hippies came to life in the mid-60s. And the Beatniks would then end as a movement in the early 70s. Please subscribe and like, as this is how YouTube decides to send it on to others. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day, and see you in the next episode.